What if the most important things students learn aren't showing up on your tests? Skills like problem solving, judgment, collaboration, they don't exactly fit into a multiple choice grid. So, how can we measure the messy stuff? Well, that's where authentic assessment comes in. Welcome back to the What and Who of EDU, where we bring you insights from the leading educators, researchers, and innovators who are shaping the future of teaching and learning. On our podcast, we share real-world classroom strategies that help you create a more impactful and effective learning environment. I'm your host, Marissa Bluestone.
And I'm Derek Lampka, your show's producer.
And today we're going beyond the buzzword to explore a different kind of assessment, one that mirrors real life just as much as it measures classroom learning. And spoiler alert, when it's done well, it has a measurable impact. We've brought the receipts, and you can find them in the show notes and with research scientist, data whisperer, and self-described assessment realist, Sarah Gray. So let's dig in. Chapter 1, What is authentic assessment? Picture this. Your history students are building a digital archive on local mill workers. They're recording oral histories, they're tagging wage records in a database, adding context, and then sharing the story online for the community. And in the process, they're learning about research methods, public speaking, and how to wrestle with tangled history. That's an authentic assessment. It doesn't look like a quiz, but it's helping students develop the kind of skills they'll actually use in college, in work, and in life. You've probably heard the buzzy term before. But what does authentic assessment actually mean? In short, it's when students do something real, or real-ish, to show what they understand, not just what they remember. It draws on deeper transferable skills like self-regulated learning, critical thinking, and collaboration. Think designing a marketing plan instead of taking a business vocab quiz, or writing a policy brief instead of circling C for climate change. The work is often complex and can be a bit ambiguous, but it's grounded in the kind of thinking students will need outside your classroom. Because that marketing plan your students just created, it's a crash course in persuasion, teamwork, and figuring out how to sell a product that nobody asked for.
If this is authentic, are the tests we use now inauthentic? Are we done with multiple choice?
Not in the slightest. Traditional assessments absolutely have their place. Sometimes you need to know if students read the chapter, remembered the formula, or managed to stay awake during the lecture. They work especially well if you're teaching in subjects that deal in rules or are just checking for foundational knowledge. You see, the problem isn't with traditional assessments themselves. It's with only using traditional tests. And newer research says the line between authentic and traditional assessments isn't so black and white. Here's Macmillan Learning Executive Learning Research Manager Sarah Gray to explain why it's about design and not labels.
So it's not whether the assessment fits into a neat little box, authentic or non-authentic. This binary that you have to choose between can feel problematic if your class really does depend on traditional exams. Like maybe they are in preparation for a bigger test like the MCAT. So just because it's a multiple choice exam doesn't mean that it can't be authentic. Even multiple choice can move up and down that authentic assessment spectrum if it targets higher order thinking skills or lets students actually choose the context in which they are being assessed.
It's not just Sarah. Researchers like Fons and colleagues also argue that authenticity depends on the degree of student choice engagement and relevance to the real world.
So it's not whether you're using multiple choice or projects. It's how real the task feels to the learner.
Exactly. And researchers like Hugh and Quinlan suggest authenticity now includes things like digital literacies and preparing students for workforce realities. For some students, a TikTok campaign might feel more authentic than a museum exhibit because it taps into skills they'll actually use. So Let's kick it off with three skills that show up again and again in authentic assessments, the ones students carry with them long after the final grade is entered. First up is self-regulated learning. It's what happens when students plan their work, monitor their progress, and adjust based on feedback, all without waiting for you to tell them what to fix. They learn to be their own editors and not just task completers. Because outside of the classroom, you're not getting a rubric, just deadlines, deliverables, and a vague email at 1 a.m. marked urgent. Next up is critical thinking. So forget those neat problems with obvious answers because the world is just not that simple. Authentic assessment asks students to analyze, evaluate, and create, often when there's no single right path. Students have to make a decision and own the consequences because life doesn't hand out answer keys. It hands you a group chat full of people who are also guessing. And finally, collaboration, because complex problems usually take more than one brain. Authentic group work isn't hive mind efficiency. It's creative friction, it's reflection, and it's figuring it out together. And when it's structured well, something even better happens. Students learn how to listen, negotiate, build ideas together, all of which is a lot more useful than being the fastest person to finish a worksheet and yell, "Done!"
Okay, but why is authentic assessment suddenly getting so much attention?
Because students are graduating into a world that looks nothing like the one our assessments were designed for. The old model got stress tested, and it didn't exactly pass with flying colors. So what we're seeing now is more like educational triage. Authentic assessment offers a more flexible and relevant path, and one that matches how students think and learn. Because while standardized tests might be efficient, so is fast food. Chapter 2, A Brief History of Authentic Assessment. To understand how we got here and why authentic assessment is still a work in progress, we've got to rewind to the progressive era. Think 1890s to 1920s. Back then, students wore knickerbockers, school lunch probably came in metal pails, and learning was modeled more like a factory than a learning lab. Students moved through subjects like products in an assembly line, with each learning the exact same material in the exact same way at the exact same pace. But even back then, some educators saw the cracks. Enter John Dewey and other progressive era thinkers who believed in learning by doing. Think labs, projects, presentations, anything that required more than just parroting facts. Now fast forward to the 1980s, the time of big hair, trapper keepers, and the rise of cognitive science. Researchers like Lauren Resnick were synthesizing a growing body of research that said, if we want students to reason, problem solve, and transfer knowledge, we need to stop assessing only recall. Because if your test just measures what students can cram the night before, you're pretty much assessing who had the fewest distractions, the quietest roommate, and maybe a second or third shot of espresso.
Wait, we go from the turn of the 20th century all the way to the 1980s? That's nearly 100 years. Are you telling me nothing happened between then?
Fair point. It wasn't exactly a century-long nap, but most attempts at deeper learning didn't scale. Think of it like the indie band of education, brilliant, beloved by a few, but never quite mainstream. Okay, let's head back to the time when mixtapes said what we couldn't put into words, but our tests expected us to. In the 80s, researchers were sounding the alarm. If we wanted students to think deeply, we had to stop mistaking memory for mastery. And that real learning meant being able to apply knowledge, not just repeat it. And that set the stage for the 1990s. Think the time when clip art was cutting edge, and your biggest group project debate was whether to use Comic Sans or Times New Roman. That's when the term authentic assessment started to gain traction. One of the biggest voices was Grant Wiggins, a teacher who authored the influential Understanding by Design. He pushed for assessments that mirrored real-world tasks, used transparent criteria, and prioritized performance over proxies. He argued we should stop testing around the thing we care about and start assessing the thing itself. We also saw the rise of educator Fred Newman's framework on authentic intellectual work, which asks three deceptively simple questions. Are students constructing knowledge, not just recalling it? Is there disciplined inquiry, like deep thinking and exploration? And does the task have value beyond school?
Okay, but when did this all go mainstream? Like beyond academic journals and workshops?
Things started moving in the 1990s, but like a rollaway whiteboard on a linoleum floor, it was progress with a wobble. States ran pilots, Vermont with portfolios, California launched a performance-based assessment program. And while these programs were bold, there were a few catches. Researchers like Shavelson and Baxter warned that measurement wasn't really keeping up with rhetorical ambition. They argued for trained scorers, well-designed rubrics, and better coordination to make it work at scale. And by the end of the 90s, authentic assessment had a reputation. Good in theory and tricky in practice. But it also had momentum and just enough scaffolding to grow into its next chapter. By the 2000s, educators had more than theories, they had frameworks. The National Research Council's report, Knowing What Students Know, introduced the assessment triangle, which links how students think, what you see them do, and how you score it. So, fewer vibes and more blueprints. Authentic assessment finally had structure that made it teachable and scalable. Then came the 2010s, and those ideas started showing up on actual tests. Welcome to the Common Core era. There was a push for consistent learning goals across states, not just what students should know, but what they should be able to do. Standardized tests began including performance tasks, less multiple choice, more show your receipts, but not in a Taylor Swift Reputation era kind of way. Think along the lines of backing up your work with claims, evidence, and reasoning. And behind the scenes, researchers were pushing things even further. Groups like Scope and Crest were asking a new question. What should it feel like to show real learning? Their take was less spot the literary device and more write an editorial that uses those devices and then explain why you made those choices. It was authentic, it was complex, and it often came with a 12-page rubric and a binder no one ever opened. Another bold experiment came from PACE. They swapped out standard tests for teacher-scored performance tasks. And with enough training and support, it scaled. Not perfectly, but it worked. Which brings us to the post-pandemic AI era, otherwise known as right now. Authentic assessment is getting renewed attention. Why? Well, for starters, if ChatGPT can answer your test in 30 seconds, your students probably already know that. That makes fact-based testing a bit too easy to game. But it doesn't have to be that way. Researchers like Salinas Navarro suggest we treat AI not as a shortcut, but as a learning partner and a co-creator. Because when used well, AI isn't replacing thinking, it's giving students a chance to practice it, to develop the kind of judgment they'll need when life doesn't follow the syllabus. Sarah Gray explains how these real-world expectations are reshaping what students need to practice now.
In the workforce, students may decide to, or be encouraged to, or even mandated to use AI to complete their work tasks. But in those workforce scenarios, they are still being held accountable for the outputs. So that means if the output is wrong, they may potentially be in a lot of trouble. So this really bolsters the case for the need for students to better learn how to critically analyze AI outputs, how to prompt LLMs to get the results that they need, and also to approve the revisions that are made. These are real skills that employers will be looking for.
And it's not just AI shaking things up. The pandemic forced instructors to rethink how they assess learning, often overnight, because students weren't in the same room, let alone time zone. And what was happening outside the classroom think health, stress, caregiving, that was showing up inside the learning. It all exposed the cracks in our old systems and created space for something new. It left us with some big questions, though. Was the way we used to assess learning really something worth going back to? These days, the push for more relevant skill based learning isn't just coming from researchers, it's coming from students, from employers, from instructors who want assessment to reflect the thinking and learning that actually matters. So now that we've got the timeline, let's pop the hood and take a look at what authentic assessment actually looks like in a classroom. Chapter 3, what it looks like in practice. We've covered the what and the why. Now let's talk about the how. According to researchers Ashford Rowe and colleagues, there are 4 qualities that show up again and again. 1, it challenges students to show real understanding. 2, it prompts reflection. 3, it encourages collaboration. And finally, it connects the work to the real world. If your assignment hits all 4, gold star. You just landed the academic version of bingo. Hooray! While there are lots of ways to approach authentic assessment, most formats fall into 3 buckets: performance tasks, portfolios, and projects. Let's take a closer look. First, there's performance tasks. This can mean writing a policy brief, conducting a scientific experiment, or even pitching a Shark Tank idea. Minus the cameras, the music, and billion-dollar valuation.
So it's basically show what you know, but with Google Slides and potentially real-world consequences?
Exactly. These tasks often mirror professional work, minus the need to go to all-day meetings, and no one is stealing your stapler. Next up is portfolios. Think curated collections like a carefully arranged Instagram grid compared to a photo dump. They could be learning journals, annotated collections, or even revisions with reflections. They show how students evolve and often reveal a lot more than a single snapshot ever could. You'll find them in writing and composition courses, education programs, or even STEM labs and engineering classes with iterative design work. Then comes projects, but there's a catch. Not all of them are authentic. A glitter poster about cell parts? That's questionable. But a PSA on hydration and cellular performance, researched and presented to peers? Now, that's authentic. Both the poster and the PSA tackle cell performance, but only one of them requires higher level thinking.
Sounds like projects can mean a lot of different things. This could easily turn into a free-for-all with someone submitting a performative TikTok dance about mitosis.
I did mention cell performance, didn't I? It could be awareness campaigns, capstone experiences, or even debates. In essence, they're the answer to what do you want students to do by the end of the unit? Once you know that, design a task around it. Let's start with scaffolding. Break the task into parts. Add some reflection. Use rubrics that actually mean something. And Sarah Gray has a design rule of thumb, which is to start at the top of Bloom.
Well-designed authentic assessment, like any assessment, begins with clearly defined learning objectives. And these learning objectives for authentic assessment should be paired up with higher order thinking skills. So think the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Students are analyzing, they're evaluating, and they're creating new knowledge. Also, it's simply harder for AI to mimic higher order thinking. Sure, it's possible, but there's not necessarily going to be a clear cut answer to these questions that are being posed in an authentic assessment. And the AI's outputs may not exactly meet the criteria that you're looking for without heavy revisions. This also gives you a valuable opportunity to grade student work based on their thinking process rather than their final product. So this definitely isn't foolproof. Students could definitely still open a second window. They could pop everything into ChatGPT and they could copy and paste their results over. That's definitely still possible. But approaching it this way is still pushing them towards a more thoughtful use of generative AI, and it mirrors those real world skills.
Because AI can't fake nuance. Not well, anyway. Sarah uses AI regularly in her research. I'll let her explain why AI doesn't have to be that magic mirror, always telling you what you want to hear.
So I personally use AI frequently in my own work as a researcher. I really don't ever take it at face value, but instead I view AI as a thought partner to help guide me as I'm thinking through my process. I have noticed that it can be a bit of a yes man and just automatically agree with me and tell me what I said was the best thing ever, unless I prompt it to do otherwise. But if I am getting that same results from multiple LLMs with different engines powering them, then I become more confident about my claims. I'll also prompt the chats to take the viewpoint of a subject matter expert in whatever I'm researching and have it poke holes in my arguments. So this really helps me think more critically and helps me refine my claims, and it doesn't replace critical thinking. It just augments it.
So she uses AI more like a subject matter expert and less like Siri insisting you turn left into a lake that it's confident is a shortcut.
Of course, I can only do this because I've developed expertise in the subject, so I can tell when the AI is right or wrong. And this is an essential skill for students too. They need to practice both of these skills, exercising their own judgment as they learn about the topic and using AI supportively. So, if your institution allows it, letting students experiment with AI as a co learner with guidance can be really powerful.
So, how do you actually grade that? It sounds like a lot.
Deep breaths. You're not grading a masterpiece, you're grading the thinking. Let them use AI to draft, sure, but ask them to revise and reflect, to fact check the output, to annotate the prompt history. Explain what the AI got wrong, what it missed, and how they fixed it. That's the stuff you're assessing. A quick rubric or reflection prompt can help. Did they plan well? Did they use feedback? Did they actually revise, or did they just change the font, play with the margins, and then call it a day? Grades should tell the story of how students tackled the task, dodged shortcuts, and actually showed up for the work. Not a free for all where half the class turns in a Canva mood board and one kid builds a volcano.
But what if I'm teaching calculus or anatomy or intro to econ with 400 students?
Totally fair question. Yeah, even in packed lecture halls or lab based courses, it still works. Take an intro to econ class with 300 students. A shared scenario like drafting a policy change to minimum wage or structured peer debate could work. It's scalable for you and it's relevant for them. Or take sunk costs. A student applies it to a team budget, and that's great. But then they hear a friend say that they're staying in a relationship because we've already been together 5 years, and they recognize the sunk cost fallacy in action. That's transfer, and that's what authentic assessment is built for. No matter the discipline, the goal is always the same: to learn whether students are able to apply what they've learned beyond the classroom. Chapter 4: What the Research Says About Authentic Assessment. Let's talk receipts. Does authentic assessment actually work? Across study after study, we learned that authentic assessment helps students to think more deeply, especially in three areas: self regulation, critical thinking, and collaboration. For self regulated learning, picture this: two students are working on a research paper. Student A follows the teacher's checklist word for word, submits it, and then they wait for a grade. Student B sets their own goals, tracks their progress, reflects on the feedback they get, and then revises with intention. That second student is practicing metacognition. Here's how Sarah Gray breaks that down.
So, self regulated learning is a form of metacognition, or in layman's terms, the way we think about our thinking. When students are regulating their own learning, they are planning their learning goals, they're planning when and how they're going to achieve these goals. They're monitoring their progress all along the way to make sure they are actually moving in that right direction and using the right tool to do so. And at the end of this process, they're evaluating their learning. Did they meet these goals that they set for themselves at the beginning of the learning process? What could they do better next time? Research has pretty consistently shown that students who display these self regulation habits not only stay in college, but perform better as well.
A meta analysis by Donker and colleagues found that teaching self regulated learning strategies like goal setting and reflection, well, it had a massive effect on learning. The effect size was 0.74, which you can think of as the Rotten Tomatoes score of education research. A 0.74, that's solid fresh. Not just this works, but this works better than almost anything else we try. In practical terms, it could translate to something like a student moving from a C plus to a B plus. And critical thinking, that's where things get even more interesting. We know that when tasks are open ended and relevant, students move past memorization and into analysis, evaluation, and creation. Think about it this way: Student A memorizes the 4 P's of marketing and they nailed the quiz. Student B builds a social media campaign for a local coffee shop and has to decide what platform to use, how to price a limited time offer, and how to track conversions. Same kind of content, but a completely different level of thinking.
Critical thinking skills are skills that go beyond rote memorization. Students aren't just learning definitions or concepts or completing drills, they're actively applying that knowledge to new situations. They're analyzing, they're making evaluative judgments and drawing conclusions from data, or even creating new knowledge, like new theories, new frameworks. What these skills look like in different disciplines does vary widely, but the fact remains that these critical thinking skills are widely recognized as essential. So, what you can do as an instructor is teach students what these critical thinking skills are and then give them opportunities to practice and reflect on that practice.
A meta analysis by Abrami and colleagues found that explicit critical thinking instruction had an effect size of 0.34. But when paired with active learning strategies like discussion and debate, that jumped to 0.75. That's major. Active learning and authentic assessment supercharge each other. But what about when students have to build those decisions together? Here's Sarah to explain why collaboration can be transformational.
Small group learning, such as collaborative learning or cooperative learning, is linked to higher achievement compared to more competitive or individualistic learning. Studies consistently show links between collaboration and retention rates, with higher engagement and improved critical thinking skills. Learning works well when the students are given or assigned specific roles or tasks within the group. That way, they know exactly what they need to do, and they are still held individually accountable for their part of the project or aspects of the learning experience, while also still promoting this interaction between students so they can learn from each other and move towards those shared goals.
In a meta-analysis by Johnson and Johnson, structured collaboration had an effect size of 0.64 compared to students working solo. It also improved metacognition, engagement, and retention.
This is digging into the data, and sure, those are great life skills. But are students actually passing the class?
Grades do still matter. We know that when designed well, there's evidence that authentic assessment can support academic performance. In a Chicago study, students in classrooms that emphasized authentic intellectual work made larger gains on standardized tests. Third grade students in high authenticity classrooms gained 20 points, compared to just 8 points in low authenticity ones. That gap could mean the difference between staying on grade level and falling behind. More recently, a 2019 pharmacy study found that students assessed through real world simulations didn't just feel more confident, they outperformed peers on applied clinical exams. These were students walking into practice more prepared to think. And in terms of workplace readiness, in a recent NACE study, 81% of students said that they were proficient in critical thinking, but only 56% of their employers agreed. Online courses are showing a similar trend. Harrington, Reeves, and Oliver found that scenario based tasks led to greater engagement, deeper learning, and higher satisfaction, even at scale.
So now we've got the test scores, the soft skills, and even the internships lining up. But what's the catch?
So far, so good, right? But there are a few elephants in the room. Oh, no! Let's deal with them. Even when the learning is great and the outcomes look good, we still have to assess learning at scale and fairly. And while we're talking about assessment challenges, let's discuss academic integrity because AI just walked into the room and it's already making plans for your finals. There's research that shows authentic assessment can reduce misconduct, but it's not a cure all. Arnold and Croxford warn that just swapping formats won't stop students from misusing AI. What really matters is intentional design and building a culture of trust. It's not just what you assign, it's how you design it. Researchers like Lehane and Wright say the most effective safeguards aren't restrictions, they're structure, scaffolding, and reflection. Here's Sarah Gray to explain.
So, authentic assessment is not a silver bullet, but some of the emerging research suggests that more problem solving, creativity, critical thinking there is in the assignment, the harder it is for AI to actually replicate that work. Require students to actually reason through complexity, to justify their decisions, and to continue to refine their thinking and document that process. You're assessing not just the content, but also their self regulation. You could even grade the use of AI as a collaboration. You'd apply the same rubric you'd use for grading student collaboration. Take this and apply it instead of from student to AI. Treat it like a partnership, one that the students are held accountable for.
Even the most thoughtful assignment can fall apart if no one knows how to grade it. Portfolios, performances, and open ended projects. They're amazing for learning, but trickier to score consistently. If you want reliability, you need trained raters, solid rubrics, and sometimes even multiple assessments per student, and that can get expensive. Back in the 90s, Vermont launched a statewide portfolio program to move beyond standardized tests. And instruction did actually improve. Teachers got more creative and students engaged more deeply. But the scoring, one school's excellent was another school's needs work, which made defending the program about as easy as explaining why pineapple belongs on pizza, which, to be clear, it does. Researchers like Shavelson, Baxter, and Pine called this out early, warning that without strong support in place, even a well-intentioned assessment can buckle under pressure.
That's a lot of academic papers. But do people actually use these tools?
They do. One standout is the AAC&U Value Rubrics, 16 outcome-focused scoring guides that help faculty and institutions assess everything from critical thinking to teamwork. In the On Solid Ground report, researchers scored over 91,000 student artifacts from more than 200 institutions using those value rubrics. Inter-rater reliability ranged from 0.65 to 0.77, with faculty agreement hitting 94% on some rubrics for performance-based assessment. Institutions have used them to refine general education programs, align curriculum, and even report out to accreditors. Those design principles we mentioned earlier are your playbook for making authentic assessment both meaningful and manageable. Okay, let's bring it home. What does the research actually say? It says that authentic assessment builds deeper learning, that it can boost achievement, especially when paired with good instruction, and that it can scale if you're willing to support it with strong design. Here's Sarah Gray to sum it up.
So, all of these skills that we've talked about, critical thinking, collaboration, self regulation, these are all on their own, individually, just good learning science practices. That's not going to change no matter how technology, how assessment instruments and tools evolve. Authentic assessment is just one way of packaging together multiple evidence based practices into one single learning experience. So, even if technology changes or higher education moves on to the next buzzy word, for example, remember when all anyone could ever talk about were flipped classrooms. So no matter what changes or what new buzzwords come up, these bedrock evidence-based principles are going to remain.
In the end, authentic assessment is all about showing what students know and how they know it. Is it perfect? No. Is it promising? Absolutely. And next, we'll look at what this actually looks like in the wild, plus a few things to watch out for along the way. Chapter 5, Practical Takeaways for Educators, or How to Use Authentic Assessment in Your Classroom. We've talked theory, we've talked history, we've even talked TikTok dances about mitosis. Now let's get into what this actually looks like in your class. Here are 10 practical takeaways to help you bring authentic assessment into your classroom the easy way. Tip 1, start with the skill, not the format. Before you think poster, project, or podcast, ask, what do I want my students to do by the end of this unit? So, for example, if you're teaching Econ 101 and want students to understand the cost-benefit analysis, don't give them a worksheet. Ask them to decide whether or not to go to a Taylor Swift concert. They'll need to weigh opportunity cost, calculate ticket markup, compare alternatives, and maybe even put a price tag on friendship drama. Ultimately, they're still learning about the concept of cost-benefit analysis, but they're also seeing how they can apply it to their own lives. Tip 2, break down the task, not the student. If the task is complex, break it up into pieces, set milestones, outline checkpoints, use templates, build in peer review. A low-stakes draft isn't just a formality, it's part of learning. Authenticity doesn't mean dropping students into the deep end and hoping they swim. It means showing them the strokes first and then watching them freestyle. Tip 3, make room for reflection. If you want students to think more deeply about a project, you could try questions from Diane Halpern's research like, what's the second best answer and why? Or what's missing from the information provided? They help students to go beyond, did I get it right? You can collect reflections as a paragraph, as a short video, or even a note in the margin. And if you want to level it up, have students annotate their own work, explaining their reasoning, identifying where they took risks, or highlighting moments where they revised their thinking. The goal is to build habits students can carry forward into their next assignment, next course, or the next time they have to make a tough decision without a rubric in their hand. Tip 4, be transparent about expectations. Rubrics are your BFF, and they're your students' best friend too, even if they don't admit it. Share them early, walk through examples. Better yet, co-create the rubric with your students. That one move alone can build buy-in, reduce confusion, and lead to better outcomes. And if students are using AI, make it clear where that's allowed and where it's not. Is it brainstorming, drafting, proofing, prompting? Let them know. Otherwise, they're guessing, and so are you. So set the guardrails before the chatbot takes the wheel. Tip 5, don't just allow collaboration, teach it. Group work is not magic. Use roles, norms, peer reviews, and check-ins to make sure it's actually collaborative, not just divided and conquered. This isn't you do the slides, I'll do the talking kind of teamwork. It's more like being on the yellow brick road. Dorothy might be the one singing, but she's not getting to Oz alone. Tip 6, add relevance. Ask yourself, where would someone actually use this? Even in intro-level classes, you can ground tasks in real-world application. So if you teach a communications class, ask students to work with the local nonprofit of their choice to create content like infographics, brochures, or social media campaigns. The nonprofits get help, students build their portfolio, and you create a bridge between school and the world beyond it. Tip 7, grade the process, not just the product. A brilliant final submission doesn't tell the whole story. Look for improvement, revision, how they responded to feedback, how they organized their time. A first draft that didn't quite hit the mark isn't failure. It's evidence that there's room to grow. Only grading the final product is like skipping to the last page of the book and thinking you understand the whole plot. Tip 8, start small. You don't need a full-on capstone project to try authentic assessment. It can be one question, one task, one shift. Try rewriting a quiz question to be a real-world scenario. Replace a discussion board with a short role play or client pitch. The small shift can make the work feel much more relevant. Tip 9. Teach students how to do the authentic work. They've been trained for years to just guess an answer if they don't know it. Now you're asking them to think like a policy analyst, a designer, a project manager, or even a scientist. Show them examples and model the kind of thinking you want to see. So, for example, if you teach a STEM class, instead of traditional problem sets, have students analyze real-world data or design a prototype. Let them know that ambiguity isn't a bug, it's the feature. Or you can have them critique an AI-generated solution. Where is it plausible? Where is it wrong? What assumptions did it make? This teaches them how to question, refine, and then to decide. Tip 10, cut the fluff. Just because something's creative doesn't mean it's authentic. A diorama of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. That's cute. But writing a director's note that explains how you'd stage Macbeth to highlight ambition and fate. Now we're talking about transfer. Focus on what shows understanding, not just what looks good on a table in the hallway. Oh, and your bingo bonus. Remember, authentic assessment doesn't have to be digital to scale. As Sarah Gray puts it, tools like AI-assisted planning or LMS analytics can free up your time for more thoughtful, often analog assignments, like in-person simulations or oral assignments that really build critical thinking. Tech doesn't replace the human part of assessment, but it does support it. So, what did we learn? Authentic assessment does not equate to an elaborate semester-long project with color-coded rubrics. It's about aligning what we teach, what we value, and what we ask students to do. It's engaging, it's dynamic, and it puts students in the role of decision maker, not just answer picker. It looks like a cost-benefit analysis of concert tickets, like a podcast instead of a pop quiz, like students showing what they know and how they know it. We know this kind of shift takes time and energy and brain space, but if you try even one small step toward authentic assessment, it might change the way your students learn and the way you teach. Because while life may look a little chaotic sometimes, we're prepping them for exactly that. And with that, we wrap up today's episode of Digging into the Data. But what do you think? Drop us a voicemail at 512-765-4688 or email the What and Who of EDU at gmail.com, and you could be featured in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share. I'm Marissa Bluestone, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to dig into the data.